There's a truth I think many people have read in Psalm 23, but haven't fully dared to believe, that if God truly is your shepherd, then there is no part of your life that is meaningless. Not the parts you don't understand, not even the parts you wouldn't have chosen. Because Psalm 23 doesn't begin with a situation. It begins with a declaration. The Lord is my shepherd. Not when life is going well, not when I can feel him, just he is. And if that's true, then everything that follows changes. It means when you can't see the way, you're still being led. When you don't feel his presence, you're still not alone. And even when you find yourself in a valley you never would have chosen, you didn't walk into it by yourself. I think most of us love Psalm 23 when it talks about green pastures, but David doesn't stop there. He talks about right paths. Then he talks about dark valleys, and then a table set right in the presence of enemies. This isn't just a beautiful poem. It's a testimony. And if you slow down long enough to really hear it, you begin to notice what runs through every line. It's not that life becomes easier. It's that the one who leads you never leaves. And maybe today, you don't need every answer. Maybe you just need to know this: wherever you are in the journey, you are still being led. Part 1. The Lord is my shepherd, but I kept trying to lead myself. All right, let's stay with that first line for a moment. The Lord is my shepherd. It sounds simple. Too simple, almost. The kind of sentence you can say without really thinking about what it means. I've said it like that before, and if I'm honest, there were seasons when I believed it, but I wasn't living like it. Not in the obvious ways. I wasn't rejecting God or anything like that. I was still praying, still showing up, still doing what I thought I was supposed to do. But underneath all of that, I was carrying the weight of trying to figure everything out on my own, trying to stay ahead, trying not to make the wrong move, trying to keep things from falling apart. And it doesn't feel like rebellion when you're in it. It just feels like responsibility. I remember one particular stretch of time. I had a decision in front of me, and I kept turning it over in my mind, going back and forth, thinking, rethinking, second-guessing. Nothing dramatic, just this quiet tension that wouldn't go away. I kept telling myself, just be wise, just think it through. But deep down, I wasn't at peace, and it took me longer than I'd like to admit to see what was really happening. I wasn't being led. I was trying to lead and hoping God would confirm whatever direction I chose. That's a small shift, but it changes everything, because a sheep doesn't live like that. A sheep doesn't wake up and decide where it's going to go. It doesn't scan the horizon and pick the safest path. It stays close. It follows. And I know following isn't always easy for people like us, especially if you're used to carrying things, making decisions, taking care of others. You get used to being the one who figures things out. So when things become unclear, the instinct isn't to wait, it's to work harder, think more, try to get control back. But that line, the Lord is my shepherd, it quietly says something very different. It means the direction of your life is not resting on your ability to figure it out. It means you don't have to see the whole path to keep moving. It means you were never meant to go first. And sometimes, the hardest part isn't the valley. It's letting go of the feeling that you need to be the one leading yourself through it. Part 2, he leads me, even when I don't know the way. You know, we don't really think about being led until the road stops making sense. As long as things are clear, we don't question much. You make a plan, you take the next step, and it all feels reasonable, predictable even. But then there are those moments where something small shifts. Not everything falls apart. It's not that dramatic. Just things don't line up the way you expected. I remember talking to a man some years ago. Good man, faithful. He had worked the same job for over a decade. Steady, responsible, the kind of person people rely on. And then one day, out of nowhere, the company started downsizing. At first he wasn't worried. He had experience. He had a good reputation. But weeks went by, then months. Applications sent. No response. Interviews that seemed promising, and then silence. He told me one evening, I don't understand. I've been praying about this. I've been doing everything I know to do. Why does it feel like I'm just stuck? Not angry, just confused. And I think that's where a lot of people quietly struggle. Not in crisis, but in that place where you're doing the right things and nothing seems to move. That's the moment where this part of Psalm 23 becomes more than a sentence. He leads me beside still waters. It sounds peaceful, calm, clear. But what do you do when your life doesn't feel like still waters? When it feels uncertain, unsettled, like you're walking through something that doesn't match the promise? Because here's what we don't always say out loud. We expect God's leading to feel obvious. We expect clarity, direction, something we can point to and say, yes, that's it. But often, it doesn't come that way. Sometimes, his leading looks like a delay you didn't choose. Sometimes it looks like a door that won't open no matter how hard you try. Sometimes it looks like you taking one small step without knowing where the next one will be. That man I mentioned, he eventually found work again. Not quickly, not in the way he planned, and not in the same field he thought he'd stay in forever. But when he looked back, he said something that stayed with me. I wouldn't have chosen that season. But I can see now, I wasn't abandoned in it. I was being moved. That's a different way of seeing things, because being led doesn't always feel like being guided. Sometimes it feels like being slowed down, redirected, even held back. And in those moments, it's easy to think nothing is happening. But that line still stands. He leads me, not only when the path is clear, not only when the outcome makes sense, even here, even when you don't know the way. Part 3, he restores my soul. But it didn't happen the way I expected. There's a kind of tiredness that sleep doesn't fix. You can rest, you can take a day off, you can try to clear your mind and still wake up with that same weight sitting somewhere deep inside you. It's not loud. It doesn't always show on the outside, but you feel it. And that's the part Psalm 23 speaks to in a way that's easy to miss. He restores my soul. Now, I used to hear that and think of something almost immediate, like a sense of relief, a lift in your spirit, something you can recognize when it happens. But over the years, I've come to see it differently, because there were seasons when I needed that kind of restoration, and I didn't feel it. I remember a time when I was still doing everything I was supposed to do, teaching, meeting people, showing up. If you had asked anyone around me, they probably would have said I was doing fine. But inside, I was worn down, not from one event, just slowly, quietly, like something had been draining out over time. And I kept waiting for that moment where it would all lift, where I would pray or read scripture and suddenly feel whole again. But it didn't happen like that, not all at once. And that can be confusing, because the verse doesn't say he might restore your soul. It says he restores. So where is it? I think that's where we have to be careful not to define God's work by our timing or our feelings. Because restoration, the kind David is talking about, isn't always something you feel in a moment. Sometimes it's happening underneath, quietly, while nothing on the surface seems to change. You see it in scripture too. Think about Elijah. There was a moment when he had done everything right. He had seen God move in powerful ways, and right after that, he found himself sitting under a tree, asking God to take his life. That's not a small kind of exhaustion. And what did God do? He didn't give him a long explanation. He didn't correct him right away. He let him rest. He fed him. He stayed with him in that place. That's restoration. Not dramatic, not instant, but real. And I've seen that in people too. A woman once told me she didn't feel stronger, didn't feel more spiritual, didn't feel restored in any way she could describe. But she said, I didn't fall apart the way I thought I would. And sometimes that's the clearest sign. You're still standing, still showing up, still holding on, even when you don't feel like you have much left. That doesn't mean nothing is happening. It might mean something deeper is. He restores my soul. Not always in the way you expect, not always in the moment you ask for it, but slowly, faithfully, in ways you may only recognize later. And one day, you look back and realize you're not where you were. You're still here. Part 4, even though I walk through the valley, you might be here. You know, I didn't understand that line for a long time. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I always thought the valley meant something obvious, something you could point to and say, this is the hard season, something dramatic, something clear. But life doesn't always announce it like that. Sometimes you only realize you're in it after you've been there a while. It's not that everything collapsed. It's just things don't feel the same anymore. You're still doing what you've always done, still showing up, still moving forward, at least on the outside. But something underneath has shifted. You don't feel as steady, not as sure, not as at peace. And it's confusing because you can't explain exactly what's wrong. I remember a man who used to sit in the same place every Sunday, third row from the back, near the aisle. For months he came in quietly, sat down and left the same way, didn't linger, didn't talk much. One day after service he stayed a little longer. He didn't say much, just looked at me and said, "I thought I'd be past this by now." That was it. No big explanation, no dramatic story, just that one sentence. And I think a lot of people live right there, not broken in a way everyone can see, but not whole in the way they used to be. That's the valley. Not always loud, not always dark in the way we imagine. Sometimes it's just a loss of clarity, a quiet heaviness that doesn't lift. But here's the part that changed how I read this psalm. David says, I walk through, not I'm stuck, not I've stopped. Walking. And I think some of you need to hear this plainly. You haven't stopped. It may feel slow, it may not look like progress, but you haven't stopped. You're in a part of the journey that just doesn't look like movement. And that's hard, because we've been taught to recognize progress by clarity, by results, by direction. But God doesn't always lead that way. Sometimes he leads in places where you can't measure anything, where the only thing you can say is, I'm still here. That man I mentioned, months later, he said something else. He said, I didn't think I'd make it through that. Not, I figured it out. Not, I understand why. Just, I made it through. And that's when it clicked for me. The valley is not where you prove how strong you are. It's where you discover you're still being carried, even when you don't feel it. So if things feel unclear right now, if you can't quite explain what's going on inside you, maybe the question isn't, what's wrong with me? Maybe it's this. Am I in a part of the journey that just looks like a valley? And here's what most people miss. Walking through the valley doesn't always feel like being led. Part 5. Through. It doesn't feel like leading, but it is. That last line, it sounds simple, but it's where a lot of people get stuck without realizing it. Walking through the valley doesn't always feel like being led. In fact, if we're honest, it often feels like the opposite. Because when you think about being led, you picture clarity, direction, something steady you can follow. You expect at least a sense that you're moving toward something. But the valley doesn't give you that. It takes that away. It strips things down until all you really have is the next step in front of you. And sometimes even that feels uncertain. And this is where the tension starts to show up. Scripture says, He leads me, but your experience says, I don't know where I'm going. Those two don't seem to match. I've sat with people in that exact place. Not dramatic, not emotional, just tired of trying to make sense of something that doesn't make sense. One man told me, if God is leading me, I wish he would be a little clearer about it. He wasn't being disrespectful, just honest. And I think a lot of people feel that but don't say it out loud, because we've quietly built this expectation. If God is leading, I should be able to recognize it. But that's not always how it works. Sometimes his leading doesn't feel like guidance, it feels like limitation. A door that won't open, a path that doesn't come together, a plan that just sits there and never becomes anything. And after a while you start to wonder if you're doing something wrong, or worse, if nothing is happening at all. But let me say something as plainly as I can. You can be right in the middle of God's leading and not recognize it. That doesn't mean you've missed him. It might mean you're in a part of the journey where he's not showing you the whole path, he's just keeping you moving. I think about Joseph. There were years of his life that made no sense at all. No clear direction, no explanation, just one situation after another that seemed to go the wrong way. If you had asked him in the middle of that story, do you feel like God is leading you? I don't think he would have known how to answer that. And yet, looking back, it was all leading. That's the part we struggle with. We want to recognize God's hand while we're in it, but most of the time, you only see it when you're past it. So here's the question that quietly sits underneath all of this. What if you're not lost? What if this confusion, this lack of clarity, this slow, almost invisible movement is not the absence of God's leading, but the way He's choosing to lead you right now? Because being led doesn't always feel like moving forward. Sometimes it feels like standing still when you want to go. Sometimes it feels like waiting longer than you thought you would. Sometimes it feels like nothing is changing when something deep inside you actually is. And I know that's not easy to sit with, but this is where that one word becomes so important. Through, not around it, not over it, through it. And you don't walk through something like that by understanding it. You walk through it by staying, by not turning back, by not forcing your own way out, by not rushing ahead just to feel in control again, just staying in step, even when you don't feel the step. Because one day, and it may not be soon, you'll look back and you won't remember every detail of how you got through that season. But you'll know this, you didn't get through it on your own. And somehow, even when it didn't feel like it, you were being led. Part 6, You Are With Me. Closer than you thought. There's a small shift in Psalm 23 that's easy to miss, but once you see it, you don't really forget it. Up to a certain point, David is talking about God. He leads me. He restores my soul. But then right in the middle of the valley, something changes. For you are with me. He's not talking about God anymore. He's talking to him. And that tells you something. The valley doesn't just change your situation, it changes your relationship. Because when everything is clear, it's easier to speak about God in general terms. You know the language, you understand the ideas, you can explain things. But when you're in a place where you don't understand what's happening, something more personal starts to happen. You stop explaining. You start reaching. I've seen that in people, and I've seen it in myself. There are prayers you pray when life is steady. They're thoughtful, structured, almost put together. And then there are prayers you pray when you're in the valley. They don't sound the same. They're shorter, sometimes unfinished. Sometimes it's just a few words, sometimes not even that. Just a quiet, Lord, I don't know. And strangely, those are often the most real. Because the valley has a way of removing everything unnecessary. It takes away the feeling that you need to say the right thing. It takes away the pressure to understand everything. And what you're left with is just you and God. That's where this line becomes more than words. You are with me. Not you were. Not you will be. No, you are, right here, in this moment, in this part of the journey that doesn't make sense. And I remember a woman once telling me, she said, I don't feel close to God anymore. She wasn't angry, just honest. And after a while, she said something else. But I don't feel far from him either. That caught my attention, because sometimes we expect God's presence to feel like warmth, or peace, or clarity. Something noticeable, something we can point to. But his presence doesn't always come like that. Sometimes it's quieter. It's the reason you didn't fall apart when you thought you would. It's the reason you kept going when you didn't have the strength. It's the reason you're still here, even if you don't feel strong. Not loud, not obvious, but real. And I think that's what David discovered in the valley. Not a new answer, not a clearer path, but a closer presence. And maybe that's what you're being invited into right now, not to understand everything, not to feel everything, but to realize you're not walking this part alone. You may not see him the way you want to. You may not feel what you expected to feel. But if that psalm is true, then even here, he is with you. Part 7, Your Rod and Your Staff, the ways he keeps you. This is the part people don't usually talk about. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. That doesn't sound comforting at first. A rod was used to protect, but also to correct. A staff was used to guide, but sometimes to pull a sheep back when it was heading the wrong way. So when David says this brings comfort, he's not talking about something soft. He's talking about being kept. And if you've walked with God long enough, you start to recognize this. Not in the moment, but later, It looks like a door that didn't open, no matter how much you prayed about it. A path that seemed right, but just never came together. A decision you were ready to make, and something held you back, and you didn't even know why. At the time, it doesn't feel like comfort. It feels like frustration, like delay, like something is in the way. I remember a man who told me he had been trying to move his family to another city. Everything lined up on paper. Job opportunity, better income, a clear next step. He prayed about it, talked it through, felt ready. But every time he got close, something fell apart. But a contract didn't go through. A conversation shifted. Timing just wouldn't settle. After a while, he stopped trying. Not because he understood, just because he was tired. And months later, something happened in that same city he was planning to move to. A situation that would have affected his family deeply if he had gone when he wanted to. He told me, "I thought God was blocking me, but he was actually keeping me." That's the difference. And you don't always see it right away. Sometimes the rod feels like resistance. Sometimes the staff feels like being pulled back when you want to go forward. But over time, you start to see a pattern. You weren't being stopped for no reason. You weren't being delayed without purpose. You were being watched over more closely than you realized. And that's not always easy to accept, because we want freedom to move. We want clarity. We want to understand why something isn't happening. But Psalm 23 doesn't say, "I understand everything." It says, "They comfort me." Not because they're easy, but because they mean you're not left on your own. A sheep with no correction is a sheep in danger. A sheep with no guidance doesn't last long. So when God steps in, even in ways that feel uncomfortable, it's not distance. It's care. It's attention. It's Him saying, without words, "You're not walking this alone," even when you don't realize it. And one day, you look back at the things that didn't happen, the places you didn't go, the paths that never opened, and you don't feel confused anymore. You feel grateful. Because you see it now. You weren't being held back, but you were being kept. Conclusions. You know, after all of this, I don't think Psalm 23 was ever meant to give you a neat answer. It doesn't explain every valley. It doesn't tell you how long it will last. It doesn't show you the whole road ahead. It just keeps bringing you back to one quiet truth. The Lord is my shepherd. And maybe that's enough. Not enough to solve everything, but enough to take the next step. Because at the end of the day, this isn't really about understanding where you are. It's about who is with you while you're there. And I know there are moments when you wish it felt clearer, when you wish you could see something, anything that tells you you're on the right path. But sometimes, the only thing you're given is the fact that you're still here, still walking, still holding on, still turning your heart toward Him, even if it feels quiet. And maybe that's not weakness. Maybe that's faith, a quiet kind, the kind that doesn't look impressive, the kind that doesn't always have words, just staying. So wherever this finds you tonight, whether things are steady or unclear or somewhere in between, I won't try to give you an answer, but I will say this. You don't have to force your way forward. You don't have to figure everything out before you move. You don't even have to feel strong. Just don't step away from the one who's been walking with you all along, even here. And I pray, in the quiet places of your life, where no one else sees, that you would begin to notice Him again. Not in a loud way, not all at once, but gently, in the strength you didn't know you had, in the peace that doesn't make sense, in the simple fact that you're still being held together. May the Lord be near to you, closer than your own thoughts. May He guide you, even when you don't recognize the way. And may you come to see in time, not all at once, but slowly, that you were never walking this road alone. Not for a single moment.